Hello, you amazing blazers, and welcome to a new story. This one is special. Overlord is my favorite anime, so I decided to cover it. Please make sure to support the writer for making this amazing story. They are Droseralex on AO3. And don't forget to like, sub, and let me know your thoughts by commenting. Now let's jump in. 23 hours, 59 minutes, and 40 seconds. The obsidian throne of kings stood in silent majesty, its sharp black angles catching the soft golden light that streamed through the enchanted crystals above. Seated atop it, Momonga rested a skeletal hand on the armrest, while the other gripped the staff of ainz old gown, a glorious weapon forged not just by his guild mates, but by his own hands as well. A culmination of their shared devotion, dozens of hours of grinding, dying, theorizing, and arguing over every spell and enhancement. Before him, the grand hall of Nazarick stretched outward in solemn splendor. The NPCs, his friends' creations, stood at attention, perfect and unmoving in their eternal vigil. Albedo, regal and radiant. Seabass, ever composed. The Guardians, each a masterpiece carved from love, obsession, or inside jokes. A living memory of bonds forged in a time long gone. 23 hours, 59 minutes, and 49 seconds. He took it all in one last time. So this is how it ends, he murmured, the words lost in the room's stillness. Guess I'll have to get up early for work tomorrow, huh? A sigh escaped him, dry, empty, but heavy with something close to sorrow. He closed his fingers slightly around the staff. It felt heavier than usual tonight. 23 hours, 59 minutes, and 57 seconds. Momonga closed his eyes. The world went dark. 23 hours, 59 minutes, and 59 seconds. Midnight. The ruins sprawled across the landscape, untouched by man or time, blanketed in silence and the slow decay of centuries. Crumbled stone and creeping ivy told the story of a civilization swallowed by the ages, its legacy reduced to fragments beneath the weight of history. At the heart of this forsaken domain stood a lonely castle, its proud towers long since shattered, now jagged silhouettes that reached skyward like the broken fingers of a dying giant. Dust lay thick across every surface, undisturbed and unchallenged, and the wind carried only the hollow sighs of a world that had long since moved on. The great hall, once alive with voices and firelight, had become a tomb of stillness. Its vaulted ceiling loomed high above fractured chandeliers and tattered banners, faded symbols of a kingdom no living soul remembered. The silence was not restful, but vacant, suffocating. Then it happened. A tremor, soft, almost too subtle to notice. A moment later, another, a deep, thrumming pulse, like the distant echo of a giant's heartbeat. The fractured walls groaned in protest, ancient stone grinding against itself as cracks spread like the veins of a disease. The remnants of the castle quivered as dust cascaded from the ceiling, banners swaying from the unseen force. The air itself then shuddered, not with the force of an explosion, nor the crackle of unstable magic, but with something worse. The very essence of existence twisted around the void that manifested in the heart of the ruins. An unseen force radiated outward, and the world trembled. A presence had entered, a presence that should not be. The unseen rhythms of nature faltered. Small creatures that once scurried through the undergrowth froze, their tiny hearts pounding with an instinctive, primal dread. The air itself carried a weight they could not comprehend, a suffocating presence that gnawed at the deepest recesses of their instincts. Rabbits bolted from their burrows, birds took frenzied wing, and even the insects fell into an eerie silence. Nature obeyed the warnings etched into its very being, vanishing just in time. And then the land began to rot. The trees groaned, their trunks splitting as bark blackened and peeled away. Leaves curled inward, shriveling to dust in an instant. The grass at the castle's foundation browned, then decayed, sinking into the soil as if consumed by an unseen force. The creatures that fled did not look back, their instincts sparing them by mere seconds from experiencing the creeping hand of death itself. Something unnatural had taken its first breath in this world, and with it, life withered in its shadow. The last grains of Yggdrasil's time had slipped away, and yet, instead of oblivion, he stood within the wreckage of a castle. Why am I still in my Yggdrasil avatar? Had the servers glitched? Was this a forced event? A hidden expansion? He clenched his fingers, tightening his grip on the staff of ainz overlord. The powerful guild weapon responded to him, pulsing with latent power, a weight both familiar and alien in his grasp. The perfectly crafted magic artifacts embedded within the mouth of each snake shimmered faintly, as if recognizing their master. Everything felt wrong. He could feel his body, not in the abstract way one would in a game, but with tangible, physical awareness. The way the fabric of his robes draped over his form, brushing against him with the slightest movement. The weight of the rings pressing against his phalanges, their magic seething with power. The chilling, overwhelming presence of his own magic, roiling beneath the surface like a restrained storm, a force bound only by his will. This level of sensory input should have been impossible in Yggdrasil. No, not just impossible, downright illegal. That would have been an instantaneous lawsuit. In Japan, full dive games had strict in-game sensory restrictions to reduce the risk of dissociation. A lack of clear boundaries could blur the line between VR and reality, with deadly consequences. There was no way the devs would allow something so visceral. Yet, here he stood. The crimson embers burning in his eye sockets flickered, betraying the thoughts racing through his mind. He tried to use message. Momonga's thoughts froze for a fraction of a second, a hollow silence filling the space where a system pop-up should have appeared. His mind, still clinging to logic, began running through possibilities, breaking the situation down piece by piece. Calm. Stay calm. The built-in game interface overlay was completely gone. No minimap. No stat screen displaying his level, HP, or MP gauges. It was as if the very framework of Yggdrasil had been stripped away, leaving only raw existence in its place. Was he powerless? Would his spells and skills work? If they didn't, that would be problematic to say the least. Lifting a skeletal finger, he focused on the familiar command, all appraisal magic item, its target being the guild staff. Instantly, knowledge flooded his mind. Not as a neatly displayed text box, nor as a system log detailing item parameters and backstory, but as pure understanding, seamlessly absorbed into his consciousness. He knew the staff of ainz overlord, down to its very essence, its properties and enchantments whispering into his thoughts like an undeniable truth. It worked. Yet, the realization did little to ease the cold uncertainty gripping him. Because this wasn't how it was supposed to work. There had been no spell cast delay, no visual indicator, no menu prompt. He had simply thought the spell, and it had responded. A creeping sense of unease slithered through his mind. Not even the highest-tier magic or cache items could bypass the game's fastidious mechanics and menus. But here, it had been instinctive. Natural. Message. He tried again. No screens, no audio cues to determine if there was a successful or failed message connection. And then, a flicker of something terrible hit him. A rising panic. Where's Nazarick? What happened to the NPCs? Is anyone else here with me? Growing desperate, he thought of something else. GM call. Game masters, as overbearing as they were with their extreme in-game moderation, had to respond to his call. Silence was the only answer. His hands twitched ever so slightly. No automated response, no prompts. Just nothing. It was like throwing words into an empty void. The last remnants of denial shattered. The implication struck him like a holy, flaming hammer to the chest. His skeletal hands trembled. Something stirred deep within the remnants of his humanity. Panic, raw and suffocating. It clawed at the edges of his mind, an instinctive, desperate reaction to the impossibility of his situation. Dark miasma oozed out of his body, wild, raw, and unimpeded. Where am I? Did I die? Am I trapped in limbo? Did I get ice-skied? His breathing quickened. No, he wasn't breathing at all. But he felt it, the phantom sensation of what should have been a ragged breath, the way his body wanted to react even though it no longer could. The weight of the unknown pressed down on him, and for the first time in what felt like ages, he felt truly powerless. And then, at the peak of his spiraling fear, his body reacted on its own. A wave of energy pulsed through every inch of his being, washing over him in an unnatural tide. Cold and absolute, it erased the panic, devouring his emotions like a starving beast. The erratic flood of thoughts ceased, the creeping fear turned to static, and in its place, nothing. Stillness. Mamanga exhaled, his shoulders slackening. His panic had vanished, reduced to nothing but a distant afterthought. Yet the situation remained unchanged. He knew, logically, that he had just been on the verge of a mental breakdown. But now he could examine his circumstances with cold detachment, as if the emotional storm had happened to someone else entirely. It was unsettling, deeply unsettling, but he could not afford to dwell on it. The facts were clear. He was in an unknown land, and he was all alone. Punito Mo's words rang in his mind. Panic is the seed of defeat, so you must maintain your calm and think logically. Remain calm, look beyond your surroundings, and don't waste your effort on unnecessary details, Mamanga. I am at a disadvantage. Vulnerable. Exposed. I need information. His crimson eyes glowed, brighter now, sharper. His mind, once reeling, now worked like a strategist surveying the battlefield. If this was a real, functioning world rather than a game, he needed to act accordingly until he could figure out what was going on. He gazed upon the staff of ainz, its presence grounding him in the face of so many unknowns. His surroundings came into sharper focus. The air inside the ruins was thick with age, heavy with the scent of dust and decay. He took slow, deliberate steps, his fingers trailing lightly over the crumbling stone as he moved forward. Every inch of the structure spoke of an era long past. Ancient, weathered stonework formed the skeleton of what must have once been a grand stronghold, now left in utter disrepair. There was no concrete, no titanium alloy, only crude masonry, fitted together by hands that had long since turned to dust. Tattered banners clung stubbornly to the broken walls, their faded colors and unfamiliar symbols whispering of a forgotten kingdom. The language inscribed upon them was entirely alien to him, indecipherable. A lost civilization. The thought barely settled before something else caught his gaze. Bones. Skeletal remains jutted from the debris, their jagged ends protruding from between fallen stones like the fingers of the dead reaching for salvation. Some were crushed beneath collapsed pillars, others half buried in the dirt as though left where they had fallen. A battlefield, not a peaceful abandonment, but a violent reckoning. Mamanga's crimson orbs flickered with an unreadable emotion as he strode past the remnants of whatever conflict had transpired here. He knew not the victors or the vanquished, only that this place had once stood against something and lost. He reached what remained of the ruined threshold. Beyond it, the world stretched outward in the dim embrace of early morning. With a single step, he crossed into the open air. The cold breeze carried the scent of damp earth and distant forests. The sky was beginning to stir, the sun marching steadily up and away from the horizon. Yet the gloom of the retreating night did little to hinder him. Dark vision painted the landscape with perfect clarity, every shadowed detail crisp and precise beneath his gaze. For a long moment, he simply stood. Before him lay a significant, circular stretch of deadened land, a mark of his own presence, no doubt. The earth had blackened, cracked, the very essence of life drained from the soil itself. The trees closest to him were rotted husks, yet beyond the corrupted radius, the world was vibrant, alive. He hummed. A surge of negative energy was the most likely culprit, wary of potential threats, especially the possibility of player killers lurking unseen. Mamanga began to layer himself with spells, methodically and without pause. Body of effulgent barrel. Greater resistance. Detect magic. Sense enemy. Perfect unknowable. Each incantation left his lips with uncanny ease, every effect surging into place instantly. No cast time. No interface cues. No delay. The magic responded not to commands, but to his will alone. It was faster, more intuitive, disturbingly seamless. Like drawing breath. He barely had to think, and that fluidity, so effortless, unsettled him. His undead body couldn't feel a chill, but something deeper, a fragment of his former humanity, shivered at the wrongness of it. And that old, familiar grip of paranoia tightened. He remained still, scanning the forest with practiced wariness. Even in the absence of threats, he knew better than to relax without assessing his situation. Yggdrasil's most lethal ambushes often began in silence. Still trees, quiet wind, and death waiting just out of sight. Traps, stealth pikers, terrain-triggered disasters. All of it could begin with nothing at all. The wind rustled through the branches, carrying no hint of magic. No hidden enemies revealed themselves. No detection spell triggered. And yet, his senses remained sharp, his posture still ready. Layers of defensive magic shimmered invisibly around him, coiled like a second skin, ready to respond in an instant. But the longer he stood without provocation, the more the tension began to dull. Stillness remained just stillness. No counterattack, no trap sprung. Slowly, cautiously, his mind eased. He allowed himself the smallest breath of calm. And yet, one more concern lingered. Offense. If his destructive spells failed, if the laws of this world rejected his arsenal, then every battle ahead could end in disaster. Defense alone wouldn't save him. He would need to test his magic. He narrowed his gaze on a distant copse of trees. He lifted a skeletal hand, fingers curling slightly as he aimed at the treeling. Fireball. The roaring sphere of flame burst from his fingertips, colliding with a thick, ancient tree in the distance. The explosion sent a shock wave of heat and embers cascading outward. Wood splintered, bark blackened and cracked, the fire licking hungrily at its new meal. The damage was devastating, but more importantly, Momonga could feel the tiniest, almost imperceptible drain on his MP. The scent of burning foliage reached his non-existent nose, carried by the gentle breeze. Fireball was a third-tier spell, basic by his standards, yet its effects had been undeniable. But a third-tier spell was nowhere near the peak of his power. He needed more certainty. If he was to move through this world with confidence, he had to confirm that his higher-tier magic remained intact as well. Let's try something with more damage output. A ninth-tier spell would suffice. He extended a hand skyward, crimson points of light gleaming from his eye sockets. Power gathered at his fingertips, an imperceptible pressure thickening the air as he uttered his next spell, called Greater Thunder. The heavens answered with a roar. A blinding pillar of lightning lanced down from the sky, its descent instantaneous. The impact shattered the earth with a deafening crack, raw energy coursing through the soil as jagged bolts arced outward. The trees caught in the blast exploded into charred fragments, bark and branches disintegrating under the sheer force. Thunder rolled across the land, a delayed, ear-splitting roar that sent flocks of birds in the distance scattering into the sky. Smoke and ozone filled the air. The once vibrant treelines stood charred and lifeless, reduced to a cluster of smoldering husks. Momonga observed the devastation with a slow, deliberate nod. His magic was intact. More than that, the spell had felt different. Not just raw damage calculated by Yggdrasil's mechanics, but true destruction. He had felt the energy surge from the skies, as if the world itself had responded to his call. He had even felt the faint tingle of static buildup on his fingers. How that was possible when he was just a bundle of bones was beyond him. This complexity was far beyond Yggdrasil's mechanics, and the implications were vast, yet reassuring. For now, there was one undeniable truth. He still wielded absolute power. Momonga cast a final glance at the desolate ruins behind him. He felt no fear, no sorrow, and yet, standing amidst the remnants of the dead, a strange unease settled within him. There was nothing for him here. Casting fly, his body lifted effortlessly into the air, gravity an afterthought. The motion was precise, absolute. There was no lag, no rigid, pre-rendered animation, only seamless, fluid movement. Not an ability granted by a game engine, but an extension of his will. From above, he would assess his surroundings, determine his next course of action. Knowledge was power, and in this unknown land, he could afford no blind spots. He ascended, the earth shrinking below him. And then, he froze. The sky stretched infinitely above, an endless canvas of shifting colors, painted in hues beyond anything he had ever seen in Yggdrasil or any archaeology in Japan. The rising sun had just begun its ascent, a golden crown breaking the horizon, its radiance spilling across the heavens in a cascade of warm ambers, deep crimsons, and soft violets. Wisps of pink-tinged clouds drifted lazily, their edges glowing with the first touch of morning light. Below him, the world unfurled in breathtaking detail. A vast ocean of green spanned as far as his eyes could see, an endless forest untouched by civilization, its trees swaying in the crisp morning breeze. Each leaf shimmered with a unique vibrancy, shifting ever so slightly with the wind. Pockets of wildflowers bloomed in hidden clearings, their colors bursting in patches of vivid blues, soft lavenders, and rich reds that stood out against the deep green undergrowth. The air was fresh, clean. The scent of morning dew clung to the leaves, mingling with the faint, earthy aroma of damp soil. There was a hint of pollen, the crisp sharpness of pine, and the distant fragrance of blooming flowers. The smell was distinct, layered, so real that it sent a ripple of unease through his mind. He could have only dreamed of experiencing this back home. Blue Planet, I know you would have loved to see this. The gentle morning breeze stirred his regal robes, carrying with it the warmth of the rising sun. Though his skeletal frame lacked flesh, he could still perceive its comforting heat. The world around him was not a mere backdrop. It breathed, moved, and lived in a way that felt undeniably real. His eyes followed a flock of birds bursting from the canopy ahead. Their feathers caught the sunlight, each shimmer unique, their flight paths unpredictable and unbound. No mechanical loops, no pre-rendered sequences, only nature's perfect, chaotic rhythm. It was too much detail. The sky, the trees, the scent of the earth. No game, no simulation, no matter how advanced, could replicate this. Momonga remained motionless, suspended in the open sky, his mind struggling to grasp the sheer enormity of it all. He had left behind the digital confines of a game. This was a world, a real world. If this was not Yggdrasil, if this was no longer a game, then his very existence had changed. That realization led to an inevitable question. What name should he use to identify himself? Momonga was the obvious choice, but it was obscure, known to no one outside of Yggdrasil. And within Yggdrasil, it wasn't widely known. The name carried sentiment, tied to friendships that had faded, to battles fought alongside comrades who might never return. But here, in this unknown world, it might be just a hollow echo, a name without meaning. Suzuki Satoru, definitely not. The thought alone was absurd. To use his real-life name would be to reveal too much. No, there was only one name that mattered. He lifted his staff slightly, staring at the masterwork of his guild, their final legacy. If, by some miracle, one of his friends had also arrived in this world, there was only one name they would easily recognize. They would understand his affiliation, his power, his claim to the legacy they had all built together. It would be unmistakable, undeniable. He straightened, his skeletal frame radiating authority, his crimson gaze unwavering. I am ainz. From this moment forth, I shall carve this name into history itself. And he would play his role to perfection. The declaration solidified something within him, a mental shift, a cold, calculated acceptance of the path before him. There was no use lingering on sentimentality or doubt. The past was gone until he could prove otherwise. The present demanded his full attention. Hovering silently, he scanned the terrain below. Winding dirt trails twisted through the dense tree line, their paths shaped by the footsteps of countless travelers. He followed the trails for some time, his eyes seeking any signs of sentient life. There, his eyes locked onto the shifting figures below. A wooden open carriage rolled along the uneven path, its worn wheels creaking with each jolt over the rugged terrain. Surrounding it was a group of humanoids, their postures relaxed yet armed. Bandits, perhaps? Mercenaries? Travelers? He couldn't be certain at a glance. Curiosity stirred. Information was power, and he needed to understand this world, its people, its dangers, and its rules. Adjusting his flight, he drew closer from above, his presence masked by his magic. It was 5 human men, their forms ragged and crude. Bare-bone equipment. He could smell their stench too. They reeked of sweat, blood, and filth. 2 carried wooden staffs topped with crudely cut gems, and they faintly flickered with magic. Mages. The rest bore rusted swords, jagged axes, and cheap pieces of armor barely held together by leather or cloth straps. Life essence assessed them below level 3. Their HP was unremarkable. Starter mobs, practically. The mages were the muscle of the group, but they were still painfully weak with appalling MP pools. His attention was drawn to the bound figure slumped at the back of the carriage, a woman in a torn blue dress, her body marred with dirt, blood spatter, and fresh bruises. She barely stirred, her muffled breath shallow beneath the filthy gag tied around her mouth. Bags of stolen jewelry and bloodied coins lay scattered around her. So bandits it is. Ainz observed the scene in silence. He knew, rationally, that this was a horrific situation, that once, perhaps as Suzuki Satoru, he would have felt some degree of righteous anger. But now, there was no empathy, only detached analysis. He pondered the muted response. Was it the result of his newly undead nature? He could acknowledge the horror, but he did not truly feel it to its full extent. It was as though he were recalling a scene from a movie rather than witnessing it firsthand. It seems I've stopped being human in a physical and mental capacity. Is this what it means to be an overlord? The thought came and went, vanishing beneath the weight of cold rationale. Below him, the world continued its cruel march. The bandits jeered, laughed, utterly unaware of the presence looming above the tree line. They were comfortable, arrogant, their weapons lazily slung over their shoulders as if this was nothing more than a routine pillaging. Within moments, they steered off the beaten path to set up a hastily built bonfire, far enough from the road and any prying eyes. They laughed as they circled the woman like vultures, their perverse intentions clear. Ainz remained hidden, cloaked in magic and silence. He could simply move on. There was no reason to interfere. He began to turn away. But then, like a cruel trick, he heard it. Mamanga, saving someone who is in trouble is common sense. It stopped him cold. Touch me's voice, so vivid it felt like a heartbeat in his hollow chest. He remembered the luster of silver armor, the sincerity in those words that once inspired and annoyed him in equal foolish, infuriating optimism. The man who never compromised, who always charged first no matter the odds. A walking monument to justice and ideals. If you have the strength to act, then act. Otherwise, what was the point of gaining power? Ainz's jaw clenched. No breath, no heartbeat, but his hand trembled. Why did those words still hold weight? Why did they sting? He didn't feel the swell of righteousness. No heroic impulse surged through him. Instead, there was an ache. Faint, distant, like the memory of warmth through frostbitten skin. Ainz looked at the girl, the desperation in her eyes, the hopeless stillness of someone who expected death. He was moving before he realized it, levitating forward, descending into the tree line like a shadow cast by judgment. Fine, he whispered, his voice hollow and low. Let's see what that idealism is worth. Maybe he couldn't feel what Touch Me did, but he could remember. And for now, that was enough. His mercy would be sharp, and his judgment absolute. 15 meters away, not a single leaf stirred at his landing. The air barely shifted. None of them reacted. He then dispelled, perfect unknowable. The horse was the first to detect him. Its eyes bulged, nostrils flaring wide as pure terror seized its body. It screamed, a horrible, ear-splitting whinny, and ripped free from its restraints, rearing violently. Two of the men barely had time to stumble back before it nearly trampled them in its blind, frothing escape. The woman bound in the cart tumbled to the dirt with a muffled gasp, curling into herself as the beast's hooves thundered away. One of them cursed. Son of a... that damned horse. As they turned, their annoyed expressions quickly shifted to wariness. Ainz stepped forward. He was an ominous silhouette beneath the shadow of the trees. His fine cloak draped over his skeletal form, the golden rings on his fingers catching the faint light. Greetings, lowly filth. His voice was deep, smooth, baritone, regal. It commanded attention. He carried himself with the slow, measured grace of a king inspecting filth beneath his heel. And they felt it. Something was terribly, inexplicably wrong. The wind felt stifled, as if suffocated beneath an unseen force. The fire from their meager camp flickered erratically, struggling to maintain its form, shrinking against the weight of his presence. Their bravado faltered. One of the men spat. He wore a cracked helm and a terribly patched-up broadsword that threatened to break if one looked at it for too long. Who the hell do you think you are? You lost us a horse, another snapped, this one toothless, bald, and reeking of weeks of unwashed sweat. You better have enough gold to pay for that, or you're dead. A third, a mage standing further back, narrowed his eyes. He had noticed Ainz's rings, and to a degree, the unnatural stillness that clung to this figure. His gut twisted, yet he feigned boldness as he aimed his staff at Ainz. How about you drop them nice shiny rings before things get real ugly? Ainz let out a muted chuckle, thoroughly amused. NPCs in Yggdrasil never spoke like this. Their personalities were often bland, repetitive, and forced, especially random mobs. Yet here these men were snarling, scheming, thinking. Their mouths were moving too, in perfect sync. He took another step forward, allowing the light to unveil his skeletal form. His crimson eyes ignited the darkness beneath his hood. The second the bandits noticed his undead form, the air changed. Their confidence shattered like brittle glass. One of the mages froze, a single tremor racking his hands in recognition. "You undead. A necromancer must be nearby," the first mage whispered, his fingers fumbling frantically through a burlap sack at his hip. "But skeletons are mindless husks. Unless a demon." "I care little for your speculation," ainz interrupted, his voice a smooth, unyielding tide, calm, but absolute. "You will release the woman. Then you will answer my questions. Comply, and you may live." It was not a plea, not a threat. It was the voice of a judge issuing a single, final opportunity. And yet, predictably, one among them broke. Perhaps it was fear, perhaps pride, or maybe just the folly of a cornered, terribly stupid animal. The man with the cracked helm gave a guttural roar and charged, his rusted greatsword raised high in defiance. ainz sighed in disappointment. He raised a finger, his motion so slow, so deliberate. It felt as though the very air had grown thick with dread. "Suit yourself." "Death." The bandit's charge halted mid-step. A choked, wet gurgle rattled from his throat as his body convulsed violently. His eyes rolled back into his skull, his muscles locking into place before, with a sound like a collapsing marionette. He crumpled lifelessly to the ground. "Wild," one of the mages choked out, staggering back in horror. His hands were shaking, yet in a desperate, final effort, he raised his staff, his voice shrill, cracking with panic. "Die, demon spawn." A glowing projectile shot from the mage's staff, streaking toward ainz, only to dissolve the instant it touched him. The meager spell disintegrated into motes of decomposing mana, breaking apart as though reality itself refused to let it exist in his presence. The overlord tilted his head slightly, bemused. "My high-tier magic immunity is intact, just as I thought." His tone was uncomfortably casual, as though he had simply commented on the weather. The bandits broke. Their bodies trembled, their wills splintering beneath the crushing weight of their impending doom. Fight or flight. Neither promised survival. ainz took another step forward, towering over them. "No more volunteers." He raised his hand once more, a skeletal finger locking onto his next target. "A shame. I'll take the initiative, then. I only need one of you alive in any case." "Death." Another bandit collapsed, his life snuffed out like a candle in the wind. The others could do nothing but stare at their fallen comrades, the icy grip of realization constricting their lungs. There was no fight to be had, no chance of escape. The Reaper had come for them. "Grasp hard." He then reached out with his hand, fingers curling as if grasping something unseen. A faint, eerie red glow shimmered to life in his palm, coalescing into the translucent image of a beating heart. Not flesh, not real, but a projection of the very organ sustaining life within his victim's chest. The mage's eyes went wide. His body shuddered violently, a primal terror overtaking him as his breath hitched, his hands clawing at his own chest, as if he could physically tear away the unseen force suffocating his heart. ainz's fingers tightened with malice. With a wet, sickening pop, the heart ruptured in his grasp, exploding into a fine mist of crimson gore. The man made no sound, no time for a scream, no final words. His eyes rolled back, his body crumpling to the ground, pale and lifeless, as though the very essence of his being had been snuffed out in an instant. Another heartbeat, another pulse of twisting magic. A second, identical heart manifested in his grip, pulsing in its final moments. Across from him, another bandit, who had only begun to crawl in his desperate attempt to flee, froze mid-step. His limbs twitched. His breath came in shallow gasps. He had seen what happened, knew what was coming, and yet, squelch. The phantasmal heart detonated, and with it, the man's body seized before he collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. His lips parted, exhaling a final, empty breath. His corpse lay motionless, his features twisted into an expression of utter horror. ainz lowered his hand. There was no struggle, No resistance. Only the quiet, merciless efficiency of instant death. Now then, he shifted his gaze to the last survivor, a mage. The man was frozen to the spot, his knees trembling. Ainz had left the most intelligent-looking individual of the lot for last. His hand reached out, lifting the mage effortlessly by the throat. If you wish to live, you will answer my questions. What is the name of this continent? The man could not answer, not because of the hand gripping his throat, but because his body was already betraying him. A violent spasm racked his frame, his limbs convulsing uncontrollably as death took hold. His skin paled, veins bulging grotesquely beneath the surface before rupturing. Blood oozed from his eyes, his nose, his slackened lips, a grotesque cascade of crimson. Flesh withered, decayed, peeling away in sickly patches until only a husk remained. Ainz tilted his head. I must ensure negative energy touch is not active before making physical contact. It seems to have enhanced effects against weak mobs. At least he found out before attempting to free the woman. He lingered for a moment, still gripping the withered husk in his hand. With neither reverence nor disdain, he released it. The body hit the ground with a dull thud, limbs sprawled awkwardly like a discarded doll. He stared at it longer than necessary. These were the first humans he had ever killed. Surely, that should have meant something. He waited for guilt to surface, anything at all. But there was no guilt, no hesitation, not even the faintest flicker of triumph. Only cold, logical detachment, as if he had simply erased a line of code or deleted a corrupted file. Why? Was it because they were scum? Bandits? Murderers? Rapists? They were the lowest rung of humanity. Did their depravity exempt him from feeling anything? Had their wickedness made their deaths meaningless? Was it something else? Had his racial traits hollowed him out? Or perhaps it was Touch Me's words. They echoed now, louder than ever, resonating not in his heart, because he no longer had one, but somewhere deeper. Something immaterial. Whatever fragment of humanity still clung to the bones beneath his robes. Maybe that was why he felt no remorse. Because somewhere, twisted or not, he had done what was right. He didn't know what disturbed him more, the lack of emotion, or the faint, almost righteous approval that simmered beneath it. Without another word, he turned, his crimson gaze shifting to the girl collapsed in the dirt, her fragile form trembling, her breath shallow. Death. The world had become death. She had known fear, knew its shape, its smell, the way it slithered into her lungs during long, sleepless nights. Shackled, beaten, dehumanized, she thought she had felt the worst the world could offer. But that illusion shattered the moment he arrived. The horse sensed him first. One moment it was still, the next, its body tensed like a coiled spring. Its eyes rolled back, showing the whites, and a terrified snort escaped its flaring nostrils. She felt the animal's panic before it even moved, a wave of raw, primal fear radiating from it like heat. Then it screamed. The horse reared violently, snapping its restraints with a sharp, splintering crack. The entire cart jolted beneath her. She barely had time to brace before the world pitched sideways. The carriage lurched, the world spun, and she was flung like a rag doll from the back of the cart. Pain lanced through her side as her body rolled across the dirt, wrists still bound, the rough earth scraping skin raw. Dust filled her lungs, and the ringing in her ears dulled the rest of the world. All she could do was lie there, helpless, gasping, and watch. Because death was here. A figure stood 15 meters away, wreathed in robes darker than the shadows he stepped from. Towering, unmoving. His presence was not loud, it did not need to be. It commanded the air, pushed it down like a boot on a dying flame. And when he moved, it was without weight or breath, like a god gliding through a dream. She did not understand what he was. Not at first. But then came the deaths. It was instant, unreal. One moment, the bandit stood there, confused by the panicked horse. The next, he crumpled like a puppet with its strings cut. No wound, no cry, just death. The others flinched. One of the mages, she didn't know his name, only his cruelty, stumbled backward and hurled a spell in blind desperation. Blue light arced toward the dark figure beyond the trees, and then it vanished. Not blocked, not deflected, unmade. The spell simply ceased to exist before it could reach him, as if the very world had rejected its presence near that thing. Even the light seemed afraid to touch him. The mage stared, dumbfounded. Then, his expression cracked. Panic spread like a disease. She could feel it in their voices. Real fear, the kind that didn't leave room for bravado or commands. They weren't wicked soldiers of fortune anymore. They were prey. Two of the bandits collapsed before her eyes, their bodies crumpling as though life itself had been quietly erased. No cry, no resistance. One moment they existed, and the next they were meat. Before she could blink, he raised a hand. Something pulsed in his palm, a heart, still beating, still slick with the remnants of life. And then he crushed it. She did not hear it break, but she felt it. In her chest, in her stomach, in the way the world tilted violently off its axis. Two more men dropped, twitching once before the stillness took them. She couldn't scream. She couldn't even blink. The last one tried to flee. She had seen him run before, fast, brutal, always in control. But now, he whimpered like a dog, tripping over his own boots. Then death was on him. A skeletal hand clamped around his neck. That was all. His scream never came. Only a gurgling, wet cough as his flesh began to peel and sag. His eyes bulged, turned bloodshot, then black. Blood poured from every hole in his face. Eyes, ears, nose, mouth, until the ground beneath him was slick with it. His skin stretched taut, split down the cheek, and sagged in strips like melting wax. His armor groaned and buckled, the smell of rotting meat filling the air as his body turned into a husk of gore and horror. She couldn't look away, even as Baal clawed at her throat. Then, with a faint rustle of robes, he dropped the ruined corpse like trash. And then, he turned to her. She saw him fully then, and she knew. This was not a man. The jawline was serrated like a predator's, and the shape of his sockets and teeth gave the impression of an eternal, malevolent sneer. From deep within the hollows of his eyes, twin crimson lights glowed like coals left to smolder in a dying fire. His pauldrons were shaped from bone, massive, curved things that jutted from his shoulders like the claws of some ancient beast. His skull was a jagged thing, too angular, too sharp, inhuman. And within his rib cage, suspended in the center of his chest, was a floating red orb that pulsed softly, like a heartbeat stolen from some forgotten god. As he stepped closer, a chill swept over her. Her breath caught. Her body locked in place. The embodiment of death approached, and she could do nothing but tremble in the dirt like an insect beneath a god's gaze. But he didn't strike. He reached for her chains. His fingers, bones of polished ivory edged in power, closed around the metal. With a lazy pull, the iron links shattered like glass. "You are free." His voice was deep, smooth, gentle even. That made it worse. The bodies, the sheer, effortless death, still burned in her mind. She couldn't hear his next words, couldn't process them, couldn't think. She only knew one thing. Death had spared her, and that was more terrifying than if he had killed her. With a strangled, soundless gasp, she bolted. Branches tore at her skin, thorns bit into her legs, but she ran. Ran until the world blurred and her lungs burned. There was no gratitude in her soul, only fear. Ainz slowly knelt beside her, his towering form folding with an eerie grace. Bony fingers reached out, grasping the rusted chains that bound her body. With a casual flex of undead strength, the iron shattered in his grip, splitting apart with a sharp crack like brittle glass. "You are free," he said in what he hoped to be a calm, reassuring tone. He observed the woman as she knelt among the corpses, trembling, wide-eyed, lips parted in a silent effort to scream. Her body was locked in place, but her gaze darted wildly. Aquamarine eyes then locked onto raw, burning crimson. And at that moment, he saw it. Pure, paralyzing horror. Internally, Ainz frowned. "That's extreme. I have not harmed her. I broke the chains gently as possible, anyway. I even gave her some space before speaking to not frighten her. I didn't threaten her. I didn't raise my voice. I eliminated her captors, the ones who were about to do unspeakable things to her. Shouldn't she be relieved?" He paused, his eyes flickering. Or is this terror not meant for me? Is she still shaken by what they were about to do? That would be a reasonable reaction. The thought gave him pause. A new variable. He tilted his skull slightly, trying to appear as non-threatening as an undead sorcerer possibly could. "Let's start over," he said, his voice lowered to a careful, almost gentle rumble. He raised a hand, palm outward in what he hoped would pass as a peaceful gesture. "May I know your name?" A faint pause. "Are you harmed?" He took a step toward her. Snap! A brittle twig cracked beneath his heel, a sharp, unnatural sound in the stillness. She bolted. In an instant, stillness gave way to chaos. One heartbeat, she stood frozen. The next, she was gone, scrambling upright with frantic limbs, nearly tripping over the corpse of a fallen mage. She tore into the forest like a startled animal, all grace abandoned for raw, desperate speed. Ainz extended his hand a little more, voice echoing over the tree line with all the warmth of a corporate press statement. "I assure you, there's no need to run. I will not harm." Not once did she look back. She was gone. Absolutely gone. "You." He stood there, hand still raised, the gesture frozen in the empty air. His jaw hung slightly ajar, a faint, hollow click sounding as the motion caught halfway between speech and silence. The twin pinpricks of light within his eye sockets flickered, dimming briefly with confusion, then flaring again, as if trying to process the sheer absurdity of what had just happened. For a long moment, ainz simply remained as he was, the heavy fabric of his robe stirring in the breeze, his skeletal fingers still politely extended toward the vanishing trail of dust. Slowly, he lowered his hand with the mechanical grace of a marionette whose strings had been cut just slightly too late. A silent sigh, more habitual than necessary, escaped him, a small, almost dignified collapse of posture. "How disappointing," he muttered under his breath, voice dry as bone, the words slipping out before he could stop them. He turned his gaze to the corpses littering the ground, then down to his own towering, grim form, a monstrous silhouette shrouded in drifting tendrils of dark magical malice. They curled and twisted from his body, faint but unmistakable, a quiet, menacing haze against the night air. Ainz stilled. Magic, he thought grimly. Passive? Leaking? Suspicion sharpened his focus. Focusing inward, he narrowed his awareness, forcing his senses away from the physical world. It required effort, more than he would have liked to admit. There, a subtle ripple at the edge of his being. A faint, oppressive thrum, like a second heartbeat, radiating from his very core. It wasn't something he had cast. It was simply there, unbidden, passive, but potent. Aura of despair, leaking from him like a silent storm cloud. The flames within his eye sockets dimmed to a faint glimmer before vanishing entirely. His shoulders sagged further, weighed down not by exhaustion, but by the absurdity of the situation. Naturally, of course, a giant skeletal figure, cloaked in black, radiating pure magical terror, standing over a field of fresh corpses and attempting, with all the warmth of a Monday morning meeting, to offer comfort. Another hollow sigh slipped from him. I truly am an idiot sometimes, he thought with a muted stab of something that might have once been embarrassment. His gaze lingered on the place where the girl had vanished into the trees. No anger stirred within him. No real blame. Only the slow, heavy realization settling in. The cold acceptance that, no matter how careful his words or how gentle his intentions, he was still stuck in a body that was the embodiment of death. For a moment longer, the hollow of his chest ached with something he could not name. And then, without realizing it, his thoughts shifted, slipping free of sentiment and spiraling down into cold, clinical logic with terrifying ease. She was still within reach. A simple dominate spell, cast before she got too far, and he could extract every piece of knowledge she held. Afterward, he could test, control amnesia. He would make her forget this encounter, eliminate the risk she'd tell others about his existence. If the spell did not work, he would ensure she would not be a threat. Death would be efficient, merciful. He had already started toward the tree line, his body moving on instinct, when his mind snapped fully into place, and with it, the horror of what he was about to do. He almost recoiled, halting mid-stride, as if struck by an invisible blow, his skeletal frame stiffening in sudden revulsion. The cruelty hadn't needed to be summoned. It had been there, waiting, natural. No shame dulled it. Only a cold, efficient path. Dominate, dissect, erase, destroy, and then move forward without a ripple of regret. Without hesitation. And it wasn't the idea that haunted him most. It was how little of himself rose to fight it. Mamanga, power is a shield. It's meant to protect the weak, not crush them. Somewhere, faint and battered, the memory stirred, the echo of a voice that had once meant so much to him. He could almost hear it, as though his old friend stood beside him once more. And for a moment, Ainz wondered if that memory was one of the few things that remained of who he had been. Perhaps if he clung to it, to touch Me's words, to his ideals, he could slow the inevitable decay of himself. The cold voice within whispered that her life was nothing, a resource to be harvested, a tool, a fleeting advantage. And yet, something colder and older in him refused in defiance, and he let her go. He stood motionless, the forest quiet save for the faint creak of branches swaying above. The bodies around him had cooled. No moans, no cries, only stillness and death. Silence surrounded him, save for the turmoil of a mind that could no longer agree with itself. He wrenched his attention away, seizing the first thing his mind could cling to, the battered equipment strewn across the corpses. He gave in to his curiosity, desperate to shift his thoughts to something less depressing. The armor and weapons were in terrible shape, scratched, dented, dirty, and poorly maintained. Woefully inferior by Yggdrasil's standards. And yet, they still held some value. For research, understanding the metallurgy, magic, and craftsmanship of this world. For trade, if they were functional enough to be sold. Or simply because a collector's habit was difficult to ignore. With a mental command, the sword he picked up shimmered faintly. Then, with a ripple, vanished into the void. Gone in an instant, absorbed seamlessly into the invisible space only he could access. Ainz paused, unmoving, as his mind processed the result. My inventory works. Not quite the same as in Yggdrasil. There were no icons, no menu overlays, but it responded to his will. Intuitively, almost instinctively. To confirm, he pictured the sword he had just stored. Without a spoken word, it rippled back into reality in a shimmer of dark light, materializing neatly into his open palm. He looked down at the weapon in silence, the soft glow of his eyes steady. A quiet, calculated relief settled over him, not an emotional wave, but a reaffirmation of stability. In a world of unknowns, this was something familiar. The retrieval and dismissal of the sword, seamless, instant, precise, proved that at least some of Yggdrasil's world mechanics remained intact. It was a small thing, but vital. He tested it again, dismissing the blade with another thought, watching as it vanished without resistance. That responsiveness, that certainty, it mattered. Now, he looked down at the artifact in his other hand. The staff of ainz Olgau. It radiated presence, a symbol of everything he was and everything he had lost. The magic in the air seemed to thicken around it, reverent and cautious, as if the world itself recognized its authority. But its majesty was also its risk. He could not afford to display it lightly. It is too important, too precious. Ainz lifted the staff slightly, as if weighing not its mass, but its meaning. Then, after a moment's stillness, he focused his will. The staff dissolved into motes of shadow, vanishing into his inventory with no resistance. Another calculated breath of relief. It was safe. He began moving among the fallen with unhurried steps. One by one, weapons, armor, and miscellaneous supplies vanished in pulses of soft shadow. He made note of anything crafted well enough to be repurposed or kept long-term, but most of it was crude, brutish gear for brutish men. He paused by the corpse of one of the mages. The man's face was pale, frozen in a rictus of fear, one hand still clutching his staff in death. Ainz reached down and plucked it free. The shaft was smooth, carved from dark wood, topped with a glimmering violet crystal that still faintly pulsed with residual magic. Unremarkable in appearance, but he turned it over in his hands slowly, methodically. Is this necessary for casting magic? A conduit, or perhaps tradition? Both. He lifted it, watching how the crystal caught the light. No runes. No magic inscriptions. Did magic follow a strict set of rules here like it did in Yggdrasil? Or was it more malleable, instinctive, chaotic? He shelved the questions for now and stored the staff into his inventory with a thought. Next, he examined the bag of coins. Two distinct currencies, clearly minted by different nations or empires. Each followed the familiar hierarchy of copper, silver, and gold, but the differences were noticeable, even without using appraisal magic. One set of gold coins gleamed with higher purity, intricate craftsmanship, and consistent weight. The other was duller, coarser, alloyed with slight impurities, a more utilitarian mint. It wasn't terrible by any means, but the difference was significant in his eyes. He held one of the gold pieces between his fingers, rolling it with mechanical precision, studying its weight and texture. With a thought, he summoned a coin from his inventory. It shimmered into existence with a soft pulse of magic. It was an Yggdrasil gold coin, flawless and untouched by time. The coin was dense, heavier, more refined in every way. Upon its face was the image of the world tree, intricately etched, shining even in the low light. He stared at it. For a long moment, the world seemed to grow quieter around him. Looking at it stirred something faint and unnameable inside him. Nostalgia, perhaps, or grief. The ache of absence. With a quiet flick of his wrist, the Yggdrasil coin vanished into his inventory once more, followed shortly by the handful of local currency. He would not waste his Yggdrasil currency unless absolutely necessary. The very thought of handing one over, giving it away, provoked a phantom ache deep in his core. The idea of some merchant in this world holding a coin forged in the golden age of his past, oblivious to its worth, was almost unbearable. They are more than currency, he thought. They are relics, symbols, fragments of a world that is no more. No, he couldn't part with them. Not unless his survival, or something far greater, demanded it. Jewelry, perhaps, he considered, glancing briefly at one of the fallen men's necks where a bronze amulet hung limp. Or raw gold. Gems. Items that hold value, but no legacy. But even then, I'll need to be cautious. He rose and moved on. Finally, his gaze landed on a few items left on the broken carriage. Most of its contents were unremarkable, basic supplies, vials of unknown fluids, worthless trinkets. But a dagger hummed faintly in his grasp, laced with a weak, lingering magic. Useless to him, but not without merit. That, too, was stored away, along with the other mage's staff. He also found a crude map, but it was faded, scribbled on, nearly unusable. He would need to compare it to another to verify its authenticity and accuracy. With nothing else of note, ainz simply turned away, his mind a whirling tempest. The thoughts stirred by the Yggdrasil coin lingered longer than he liked, and they swirled in with his earlier turmoil. Fragments of memory, of voices, of companionship, threatened to surface. He needed to silence them for now. He needed clarity. He cast, perfect unknowable, once more, the spell wrapping around him like a veil of absence. Then, without urgency, he began walking, down the same dirt path the bandits had once followed, now emptied by death. His footsteps were silent. The breeze rustled the trees around him, stirring leaves into soft motion, but his robe remained almost motionless, weightless against the hush of the forest. There was no noise save for the natural rhythm of the wild. No voices, no orders, no pressure, only the rustling leaves, the scent of damp earth, the occasional creak of a swaying branch. It was quiet, peaceful, and in that quiet, ainz let his mind drift, not to plans or threats or power, but to stillness. He would walk for a while longer, not to reach a destination, but to remember, if only faintly, what it meant to move through the world without purpose. The world was beautiful, painfully so. The rustle of leaves overhead, the dappled sunlight breaking through untouched canopies, the soft call of distant birds. All of it felt unreal, like something lifted from a storybook he had never been part of. In Japan, such untouched nature had long since vanished beneath the calamitous wave of ruthless development, global pollution, and cold steel arcologies. He had only seen forests like these in photographs, documentaries, or fleeting moments rendered through pixels in games. And now, to walk through one, to feel it, was like stepping into a dream, a daze. He felt it then, faint but undeniable. A thrill, not of battle, not of conquest, but of discovery, of wandering a living world not bound by mechanics or menus. The old, buried longing for adventure stirred within him, fragile and unexpected. Blue Planet would have wept at the wondrous sight of this world, he thought. He would have cried like a little child. And for the first time since his arrival, a memory almost made him smile. The path wound lazily beneath his feet, and the temptation to lose himself in the simple beauty of the world gnawed at him. Yet even amidst the splendor, darker thoughts resurfaced. Why am I here? How did I get here? Did some unseen force orchestrate this? Was this punishment? There were no answers, only silence and the slow, endless passage of time. He glanced down at himself. The robe, the jutting bones, the faint crimson glow emanating from his hollow chest. An overlord, powerful beyond mortal limits. Unaging, immune to poison, to disease. Without the need to sleep, unable to ever feel hunger, thirst, or taste. Burdened with an existence that would strip him almost entirely of emotion. Ainz flexed his fingers absently, watching how the blackened shadows played between them. How long before I lose myself completely? The thought was a morbid one, but it lingered. Already he could feel it. The stunted emotions, the detachment that came not from choice, but from simple existence. It was one thing to roleplay an overlord within a game, when the true consequence was only pixels and text. But now he inhabited the body of one. Would he, too, one day completely forget what it meant to feel? Would the memories of Touch Me, of Bukabukagama, of Nishiki Enrai, of all of his friends, one day be just faint echoes he could not grasp? Was he even human anymore? Ainz walked on, his mind turning in circles he could not slow. How long would he live? Centuries? Millennia? The thought of endless existence, endless detachment, was as terrifying in its own way as death had once been. He clenched his hand again, this time with grim purpose. I must hold on to something. Something human. Memories. Honor. Something. Or risk becoming a monster so slowly he would not even notice. The thoughts blurred together, sorrow, wonder, fear, until time lost its grip entirely. He walked without thinking, only dimly aware of the passage of sun and shadow. The quiet rhythm of his steps blended into the natural harmony of the forest. He had been walking since sunrise, and now, as the sun reached its zenith, casting stark shadows beneath the swaying trees, he realized how much time had slipped away. With perfect unknowable, fully masking his presence, nature flourished without fear. Birds flitted between branches, their songs weaving through the rustling leaves. Small creatures darted across the path, some pausing to sniff at the air before scurrying into the underbrush. Even the trees themselves seemed more alive, their limbs stretching skyward as if welcoming the golden warmth of midday. How odd. He had walked for hours, the world awakening around him, but not once had he encountered another soul. No distant voices, no carriages, no approaching footsteps. Just the whisper of the wind and the occasional snapping of twigs beneath his feet. Eventually, the road split in 4 directions, each path disappearing into the unknown. Ainz's gaze swept over the choices before him, weighing his options. He decided to follow the largest of the dirt roads, its worn trail winding steadily up a smooth, rolling hill. Time blurred again as he walked. Minutes stretched into something longer, unmeasured and abstract. The road meandered through thickets and clearings, the scenery changing slowly, subtly. The sun had begun its slow descent, bleeding amber light through the tangled branches of the forest. Despite his usual vigilance, Ainz realized he had allowed himself to drift, deeply lost in the quiet, endless world around him. It was a dangerous lapse. He refocused at once, sharpening his senses, sweeping his gaze across the dimming environment with renewed precision. The shadows grew longer now, twisting and writhing over the gnarled roots like dark fingers reaching for the earth. The air was cooling, the sounds of insects rising and falling like a distant tide, filling the spaces between the weary sighs of ancient trees. And then, something sharpened inside him. A faint tug, a prickling sensation where nerves should have been, crawling faintly across his form. Something moving, something stalking. It felt magical, not the crisp magic of a cast spell, but something murkier, wilder, predatory, watching, following me, or someone else. His mind locked into precise, clinical focus. Logically, it could not have been tracking him directly. Perfect unknowable still cloaked his presence completely, not merely hiding him from sight or sound, but severing his existence from magical detection. No ordinary magic should have been able to pierce that veil. It was not him they followed. He was nearly certain. Still, the sensation unsettled him. A whisper of a threat, or perhaps simply a reminder that this world's magic moved differently, with laws and instincts he had yet to fully unravel. He filed the sensation away for future study. Perhaps this was another change, some strange fusion between his powers and this world's magic. For now, caution remained the wiser choice. As quickly as the stalking presences had brushed across his awareness, they seemed to drift away in a hurry, melting into the deeper woods, leaving the air lighter in their absence. He moved forward with more care. The dark folds of his robe whispered along the forest floor, blending with the lengthening shadows, his presence little more than a ghost among the ancient trees. After some time, the forest began to thin into a broad, uneven hollow, the trees retreating, giving way to a stretch of battered grass and stone. Ainz advanced cautiously through the thinning woods, the scent of smoke and something fouler prickling at the edges of his awareness. Ahead, fearful shouting echoed, frantic, sharp cries fraying into panic. Through the gaps in the canopy, he glimpsed it, a thin column of smoke, curling into the sky like a wounded spirit, barely visible against the dying light. There, two wagons, battered and splattered with mud, stood half-sunken near the hollow's center. Crates were stacked hastily between them, sacks of grain, iron tools, casks of water, goods too vital to abandon. A handful of guards held the perimeter, blades trembling in unsteady hands, their gazes locked on the treeling. Between the wagons, a cluster of figures huddled low, civilians, vulnerable, hidden as best they could amid the scattered supplies. Beyond them, the forest itself seemed to breathe, the gloom pulsing with unseen menace. Then he heard it, a howl, low, twisted, almost a sound of tearing flesh rather than living throat. Another howl answered it, then another, and another, until the air vibrated with a chorus of broken, monstrous hunger. He knew then, these were the presences he had sensed before. They hadn't been hunting him. They had been stalking these people. And from the treeline, they emerged. Massive wolves. No, creatures shaped mockingly like wolves, spilled from the shadows. Their bodies were grotesque, too large, too muscular, twisted as if stitched together from nightmares. Patches of exposed sinew glistened wetly where brown, matted fur should have been. Their eyes burned with rabid, mindless malice, glowing like hot coals in the dark. They moved as one, and then they charged. One of the guards, shouting a desperate, wordless cry, sprinted to meet them. His blade sang as he struck the first beast, a clean blow, driven by every ounce of mortal bravery. It clanged uselessly off the creature's upper hide, rebounding as if he had struck stone. The guard stumbled. The wolf thing lunged. Its massive jaws snapped shut around the guard's waist, armor and all, with a sickening crunch. The breastplate, meant to withstand swords and spears, crumpled like a tin can, jagged shards splitting outward as the creature's fangs punctured through steel and bone in a single, unstoppable surge. The guard didn't even have time to scream properly. Only a raw, broken gasp tore from his throat as he was ripped off his feet. He hit the ground hard, dragged backward into the grass as the creature shook him like a doll. The others pounced. A mass of gnashing teeth and matted fur descended, biting, tearing, gouging, their maws plunging into the exposed meat where the shattered armor had given way. The guard's screams dissolved into a choking, gurgling noise, barely human, before vanishing altogether under the wet, crunching frenzy of feeding. There was no struggle after that. No fight left. Only the brutal, methodical work of jaws and claws reducing him to nothing. The second guard hesitated, just for a moment. But that moment was enough. He had seen it, seen his friend crumple like a snapped reed, torn apart in the jaws of monsters, his screams swallowed by blood and teeth. The horror of it clung to him, thick as smoke, wrapping icy fingers around his spine. Still, gritting his teeth, forcing trembling legs to obey, he stepped forward, placing himself between the beasts and the cowering travelers. A desperate swing of his sword lashed out as another wolf thing lunged from the smoke. A wild, instinctive strike. Steel-kissed matted fur, a shallow gash tearing across the creature's flank, but it was nothing. The retaliation came in a blur. Claws, each one like a butcher's hook, tore into his gut, the metal of his cuirass shrieking, bending, then ripping apart like wet parchment. The blow dug deep, carving a ragged canyon through flesh and muscle. Blood poured freely down his armor, a gushing, hot flood that stained the battered steel black. The guard staggered, his sword dropping from numb fingers. He clutched at the ruin of his belly with both hands, trying uselessly to stem the flow. His mouth opened. No scream came, only a hoarse, broken croak. His knees buckled, and only sheer, desperate will kept him upright, shielding the caravan with the battered shell of his body. But he knew he would not last another blow. That death was already reaching for him, clawed and inevitable. The leader of the caravan, an older man with a ragged beard and thin, graying hair plastered to his forehead, stood protectively in front of the others. A deep scar cut across his weathered cheek, a harsh line earned from battles long past. His grip tightened around a short sword, the blade shaking in hands more familiar with steering wagons than wielding steel. Behind him, a woman clutched 2 crying children to her chest, shrinking back against the wagon like a cornered animal, her wide eyes darting between the trees. Ainz watched it all unfold with clinical detachment, the cold, ticking machinery of calculation moving in his mind. Was it worth intervening? These people, strangers, frail, unremarkable, posed no threat to him. They held no value beyond perhaps scraps of knowledge. Their lives, their deaths, either outcome would ripple no further than this clearing. It would change nothing for him. It was. Then he heard it. A sound that cleaved straight through the fire, the blood, the howls. Small, raw, shattering. The children, their cries, high, panicked, pure, pierced the battlefield like needles through cloth. Not the roars of soldiers facing death. Not the howls of beasts. Just helpless, terrified sobbing. The older child, a boy no older than 6 or 7, wriggled free from his mother's desperate arms. His small hands fumbled across the battered wagon seat, grabbing for a rusty short sword left behind by the fallen guards. He gripped it in both trembling fists, the blade almost too heavy for him, and stumbled forward, planting himself between the beasts and his mother and sister. His knees shook. His body was thin, unarmored, laughably defenseless. But he stood, tiny, fragile, an ember defying the storm. Ainz watched, something deep inside him beginning to shift violently. The boy lifted the blade awkwardly, teeth bared in terror and defiance, a human shield no thicker than paper. Tears poured down his face. It was a futile gesture, meaningless in the face of what approached. But it was brave, honorable, and it shattered whatever cold calculation still tried to hold him back. Ainz's next thought withered unfinished, lost in the still-burning gears of his mind. The cold detachment buckled. The screams were not anger, not defiance, just a desperate plea for something, anyone, to save them. It struck something buried but not yet dead. Saving those in trouble is common sense. A memory, an echo, distant but unyielding. The boy screamed again, and without realizing it, his feet had already moved. There was no time for disguise or illusions, no time for strategy. Only the cold certainty that if he delayed even a heartbeat longer, those cries would be silenced forever. And that he, ainz gown, would have let it happen. He drifted through the smoke like a tide creeping in before a storm, slow, relentless, silent. His black robes billowed behind him like the dark waters of an oncoming flood. Death moved, but not as a mindless force. It moved with purpose, with judgment, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The wounded guard staggered upright, his sword trembling in his blood-slicked grip. His gut burned, wet and hot beneath his armor. His free hand clutched the wound tightly, struggling to keep his insides where they belonged. He could barely feel his legs. His knees buckled, every heartbeat sending white flashes across his vision. Still he stood. Still, he raised his sword. The beasts slunk closer through the burning haze, their eyes molten, slavering jaws wide. He knew, even as he steadied himself on numb legs, that he wouldn't survive. But if he could buy just a few more seconds, a few heartbeats more, then maybe, just maybe, they could run. He sucked in a raw, burning breath. The monster leapt. Just as a voice, deep as thunder and heavy as stone, split the darkness in two. Death. The words hung in the air like a decree. The beast, lunging for the guard, gurgled mid-leap. Its body shuddered once. The burning malice in its eyes flickered out, and the thing collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, skidding lifeless to the guard's feet in a heap of dead meat. The guard flinched back, his sword lowered, disbelief churning with terror. Before he could even comprehend what had happened, the same baritone voice rolled through the air, louder, darker, undeniable. Fireball. The night exploded. White-hot light ripped across the battlefield, engulfing a cluster of beasts in a storm of flame. The explosion drowned the world in a deafening roar, so bright it turned night into day. Fur blackened and peeled from flesh. Sinew shriveled. Bones cracked and burst like overripe fruit. The beasts howled as they burned, their shrieks rising into high, broken wails, the sound of panic, pain, and dying rage. The air thickened, choked with the stench of scorched fur, boiling blood, and blackened earth. The travelers turned, instinctively, desperately, to see what horror had eclipsed the others. And they saw death itself. Through the swirling ash and rolling smoke, it advanced, slow, deliberate, inevitable. A towering skeletal figure, cloaked in blackness so deep it seemed to bleed into the world around it, the robe trailing like a wound through the smoke, swallowing every flicker of light that dared to touch it. Jagged bone pauldrons crowned its shoulders, each embedded with a red orb that burned like banked coals. Its ribs were bare to the world, and within, a molten, seething sphere floated, a dark sun pulsing at the core of his form. And its face, a bleached human skull, but twisted, corrupted. The cheekbones were jagged, the jaws sharp like shattered blades. The canines were long and pointed, cruel and predatory. Dark, razor-thin fractures spread from the hollow sockets, as if the force of whatever burned within had cracked the bone itself. Within those sockets, crimson fire seethed, not flickering, but roaring, endless, merciless, without a shred of warmth. It grinned, not in mirth, but with frozen malevolence, a bestial sneer carved into the very shape of death itself. It moved soundlessly, one skeletal hand extended outward in silent, inescapable judgment. The beasts faltered, turning as one, their hackles rising, as the weight of death pressed down upon them. What had been snarls twisted into high, broken whines, the bravado bleeding out of them like smoke. For a moment, they shrank back, a primal fear overcoming their frenzy. Then, perhaps out of sheer number, perhaps out of sheer stupidity, they charged. The figure tilted its head slightly, almost pityingly, as though disappointed by their stubbornness. And then it spoke, a voice that thundered without shouting, deep, resonant, undeniably masculine. Triplet maximize magic, fireball. 3 infernos bloomed into existence, grander, denser, their searing heat distorting the air, each one a fully realized sphere of destruction that dwarfed the first by sheer intensity. The first slammed into the lead pack, detonation blooming outward like a hellish flower. The second exploded deeper in, shredding beasts mid-leap, sending charred bodies tumbling through the air. The third swallowed the rear, snuffing out the last flickers of retreat before they even began. The woods around the battlefield caught fire, the smoke thickening into a choking storm. The world itself seemed to hold its breath, and through it, the skeletal figure advanced, untouched, unstoppable. The guard, with a grunt of exhaustion and pain, collapsed onto the blood-stained ground, his cracked sword falling from limp fingers. It was not cowardice. It was not fear. It was the simple, inevitable failure of a body that could endure no more. He wept, not from relief, but from terror, the primal, marrow-deep terror that told him they had only traded one death for another. The travelers clutched each other, some whispering frantic prayers, others weeping openly. Their savior, if it could even be called that, was not a knight, not a hero. It was an executioner, a being of bone and doom and fire, moving with the inevitability of a falling star. It now stood alone amidst the burning wreckage, a silent sentinel of death. Smoke coiled around him like mourning veils, the dying fires painting his exposed bones in molten gold and crimson hues. For a moment, all was still, and then a shadow blurred through the smoke. One of the beasts, larger than the others, ribs jutting from matted flesh, its jaws foaming with desperate rage, slipped through the inferno at a low sprint, angling to flank him from behind. There was no chance for warning, no chance for defense, only helpless recognition. But the skeletal figure, the thing that wore death like a mantle, did not move, did not turn. did not raise a hand. He simply waited. The beast, thinking victory was at hand, lunged, jaws widening, teeth snapping for bone. And then, in a blur faster than mortal eyes could follow, one hand snapped backward. Sharp, bony fingers clamped around the beast's throat with unyielding force, lifting it clean off the ground. The monster dangled helplessly, legs kicking in blind panic, claws scrabbling against the skeletal arm. Death tilted his skull, regarding the struggling thing with the dispassionate curiosity one might spare for a worm squirming on a hook. The creature snarled and gurgled, slashing wildly, but its claws struck an unseen barrier, rebounding with hollow, metallic blows hit bone and cloth, as if striking pure adamantite, each impact reverberating uselessly into the air. Death did not flinch. He did not raise a hand in defense. It was as if the world itself refused to let harm touch him, as if reality bent around his form, rejecting violence with a quiet, absolute finality. The skeletal hand tightened, slow, inevitable, as if the creature's resistance was beneath even his contempt. No anger, no malice, only the cold, mechanical certainty of death fulfilling its duty. The beast thrashed, once, twice, its back legs kicking in blind panic, its eyes wide, froth bubbling from its slack mouth. And then, with a dreadful, effortless squeeze, the beast's throat compressed. There was a wet, grotesque pop, the grinding of flesh and bone giving way. Its head separated from its shoulders, dropping to the scorched earth with a hollow, organic thud. The corpse slumped heavily to the ground beside it. As it hit the dirt, the body blackened, rotting rapidly into curls of ashen smoke and flecks of dark manna, dissipating like burned paper in the wind. The skeletal figure did not so much as glance down. He simply let the gore-slicked bones of his hand drift back to his side, unmoved, unstained, untouched. The rings adorning each finger caught the firelight, gleaming with a pristine, otherworldly luster that nothing could mar. The merchants shrank back as that burning, hollow gaze then fell upon them. Two pits of seething crimson flame staring out from beneath a jagged crown of bone. The fires danced upward, twisting like living things, casting his form in shades of black and blood red. They stared, paralyzed, unable to fully comprehend the casual brutality and devastation they had witnessed. The boy, falling to his knees before his sister and mother, swallowed hard, eyes wide and shimmering. The guard staggered only a few paces before collapsing, dragging himself toward an elderly woman who had scrambled down from the back of a wagon. She caught him without hesitation, her frail arms steady despite the tremble in her hands. She pressed a blood-stained cloth against his side, murmuring soft, broken words meant more to comfort than to heal, her gaze flickering nervously between the dying man and the unearthly being standing motionless nearby. The world had fallen still, broken only by the crackle of burning wood, and the soft, stifled sounds of suffering, the low groans of the dying guard, the choked sobs of the grieving, and the quiet, trembling whimpers of those too scared to move. Their instincts screamed at them to flee, but their bodies, frozen, obeyed only terror. Death then took a single step toward them, a whisper of motion, and the earth itself seemed to flinch. Faces twisted in fear, eyes squeezed shut, hands clenched in desperate prayer, trembling as they offered silent, broken pleas to the goddess of creation, asking only for a painless death, for swift passage into paradise. They waited for the end, for the searing bite of magic, the unraveling of flesh by unseen forces, the final agony wrought by death itself. Time passed, seconds, perhaps minutes, but death did not come. Instead, a voice broke the silence, cold, distant, yet not cruel. "Fear not," it said, a command wrapped in the thin trappings of comfort. "I mean you no harm." The forest burned. Only the crackle of fire and the heavy, choking smoke remained. Ainz moved forward, slow, inevitable, through the blackened earth. His crimson gaze swept over the remains of the battlefield with detached calculation. The beasts' corpses crumbled before him, not into blood and viscera, but into motes of dark ashes that drifted upward like dying embers, devoured by the world itself. Curious, were they not living creatures? Perhaps constructs of magic? Then, turning, he faced the surviving humans. Their terror slammed into him like a wall, a suffocating, tangible thing that clung to the burnt air heavier than the smoke. It twisted their faces into masks of raw, instinctive horror. The wounded guard had collapsed upon an elderly woman, his broken sword abandoned behind him, dropped when his strength finally gave out. His hands, slick with blood, now clutched feebly at his torn armor, as if trying to hold himself together. He trembled violently, wide eyes fixed on Ainz with the vacant, hollow look of someone whose mind had broken under fear. The elder merchant staggered as he backed away, his blade barely held aloft by trembling hands. Behind him, the woman clutched her children to her chest, rocking them as she wept. The boy, the brave little fool who had once stood to defend them, sobbed quietly into his mother's torn cloak, his tiny shoulders shaking with helpless terror. "Merciful goddess," the woman whispered hoarsely, "forgive us, deliver us from this curse." Their prayers were not for survival any longer. They were for a painless death. Ainz stood unmoving, a specter wreathed in flame and ruin, watching them with those burning, hollow sockets. A flicker of something, guilt, or perhaps shame, stirred within him. He hadn't meant to terrify them. It had just happened. A reflex not entirely his own, born from the alien instincts that lurked in this body he barely understood. Even with good intentions steering him, his very existence felt like a disaster barely held in check, a force of death struggling to walk gently through a world not made for him. His eyes drifted over the travelers, taking them in. Every flinch, every tightened grip, every step half taken back, building up. If he allowed their terror to take root, if he let them brand him as the monster their minds already feared, no explanation would save him later. He had to act. Slowly, carefully, he raised his skeletal hands, palms outward in the universal gesture of peace. It felt unnatural, alien, but he forced it, a deliberate, conscious effort to bleed the faintest trace of gentleness into his hollow, echoing voice. "Fear not," he said. "I mean you no harm." The words floated across the smoking battlefield, low, cold, but measured, like the stillness that follows a storm. Still, no one moved. No one answered. They simply stared, paralyzed, breathless, at the specter who had snuffed out monsters with the same casual ease a man might brush away flies. The dying fires now painted his bones in pure crimson, illuminating every jagged line of his skull, every wicked fracture spreading from his hollow gaze. Ainz waited, patient, regal, letting the silence stretch just long enough. At last, one of the older men staggered forward a step, boots dragging in the blackened dirt. His voice cracked like a dry twig. What are you?" Ainz turned toward him, not swiftly, but with slow, deliberate control, as if even the motion of acknowledging the question was dangerous. Even now, he knew that every gesture mattered. One wrong move, too quick, too sharp, and they would collapse entirely into blind panic. He weighed his options swiftly. The cries for mercy, the word curse whispered between clenched teeth. They were clinging to superstition, desperate to believe in something less monstrous, something they could understand. It was an opportunity, a crack in their terror, raw and bleeding. Ainz saw it for what it was, a story waiting to be written, a weakness waiting to be shaped. Cold, merciless calculation stirred beneath the surface again, the instinct to seize it, twist it, bind their hope to him before it could wither. The flicker of shame came after, sharp and bitter, but he smothered it. Survival, integration, if somehow possible, demanded ruthlessness. It left little to no room for guilt. He lowered his hands with a slow, careful grace, a deliberate shedding of aggression. Every movement was measured, as if any sudden motion might shatter what little calm he could coax from them. When he spoke again, his voice carried something else, a low, heavy sorrow that rang hollow even to his own ears, but needed to be believed. "I was once a man," he said quietly, "a great mage. Long ago," he let the words drift, a faint breath against the smoke-choked air. "I was cursed." He let the word hang, deliberate, tragic, bitter, giving it room to sink into their minds, to simmer and fester. "A curse that stripped me of flesh and bound me to this form." Ainz spoke carefully, his voice measured, almost hollow. The merchant wavered where he stood, confusion and horror warring across his face. And then, From the back of the group, a brittle, trembling voice broke the silence. "Did a demon curse you?" The question cracked across the air like a whip, sharp, desperate. Like a lifeline thrown to a sinking ship, it was too valuable to ignore. Ainz inclined his head, slow, grave, almost kingly, a gesture weighted with the heavy illusion of old sorrow and resigned burden. "Yes," he said, the single word falling like a stone into the tension-choked air. His voice came low, steady, and grim, shaped carefully, almost artfully, into something that sounded like a man carrying centuries of loss. "A demon's curse twisted me into—" He hesitated, just for a breath. "This." The word scraped out, laced with a flash of spite and quiet revulsion, as if even speaking of his form sickened him. The acting was superb, too superb. A flicker of guilt gnawed at him again, but he crushed it beneath the grim demands of survival. He let the statement linger, heavy as a funeral bell, and as the word demon left him, something else clicked coldly into place. Demons exist here. The realization unfurled with quiet inevitability. His fabricated story, spun from necessity and desperation, was suddenly no longer a distant invention. If demons were real, if this world already knew of beings who could bend magic beyond human understanding, then his existence, his monstrous form, his powers, all of it sounded infinitely more plausible, believable, anchorable within their fear. And just like that, the lie he had crafted became something stronger. Not an invention, but a tragic casualty in a world already haunted by darker truths. Ainz said nothing more, allowing the silence to steep in the smoke and dying firelight, the illusion tightening its hold without a single wasted word. The merchants flinched back as if struck, a ripple of instinctive terror running through their ranks. For a moment, there was only silence, thick, raw, trembling. And then, whispers, soft, fragile, desperate, rising like brittle leaves stirred by a storm they could not escape. The words fluttered like dying embers across the smoke-heavy air, fragments of horror trying to understand what their eyes refused to believe. They spoke in hushed voices, thinking their fears too soft for him to hear. But undeath sharpened senses as cruelly as it dulled emotions, and every brittle word reached him clear as bells. Ainz stood in silence, the whispers scraping against the hollow places in him. Guilt pricked at what little warmth remained in his heart. Guilt that he had become something worthy of their pity. And beneath it, something colder stirred. A small, wounded pride, smarting at the idea that they saw him as little more than a broken, cursed relic staggering through the ashes of a life lost. Yet, his gamble had paid off. Their fears shifted, subtly, painfully, like a blade slowly turning in the wound. It was no longer the sharp, blinding terror of prey before a beast. It became something heavier, grimmer, pity, dark and horrified, for the figure that stood among the burning wreckage. Pity for something that had once been human. Pity for something that had been twisted beyond recognition. Pity for something too monstrous now to ever return home. Ainz said nothing. He simply stood, a black silhouette against the ruin he had both ended and embodied. The fire cast deep shadows across the jagged sneer of his skull, the cruel brilliance burning within his hollow gaze. He made no move to soften the image. No plea for forgiveness. No reaching hand. Only the quiet, terrible dignity of something too broken to beg and too powerful to fall. In that silence, something delicate began to shift. A breath caught. A trembling hand lowered from the hilt of a sword. A prayer, half uttered in fear, faltered on cracked lips. And in the broken spaces between heartbeats, something fragile, battered and bleeding, but stubborn, began to take root. Trust. Not whole, not clean, but real. Ainz let it happen, feeling it settle across the group like a faint, tentative thread stretched between survivor and savior. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply stood, allowing the flames and ruin to sculpt the mask he needed to wear, a mask of sorrow and power, victim and warning. As the wind moaned through the hollowed battlefield, carrying the last dying smoke away, the humans stared not at a monster, but at the ghost of a man the world had already crucified once. And yet, even as he seized the story he had spun with ruthless precision, another part of him recoiled, the faint, broken remnant of the man he had once been. Was this what was left of his humanity? manipulating fear and grief, selling himself as a victim to survive. The thoughts gnawed at him, raw and accusing, but ainz forced them down. He had no choice. If he wanted to walk among mankind, if he wanted to preserve even a fragment of what he once was, he needed them to believe. He needed to cling to something, even a lie. The travelers shifted. Their sadness was not pure any longer. It had curdled into something sharper. Hate. They cursed the demons under their breath, muttering dark prayers and spiteful oaths, old words shaped by long memories of suffering. Ainz noted it carefully. The hatred of demons ran deep, primal and ancient, woven into their very understanding of survival. It was useful, but dangerous. He felt a flicker of curiosity about these creatures he had yet to meet in full, but alongside it came a growing wariness. Anything that could provoke this kind of universal loathing among humans could not be underestimated. Best to learn more. Best to tread carefully. If survival demanded that he become a legend of sorrow and ruin, then he would wear that mask as easily as any other. But maybe, he thought bitterly, maybe clinging to their hope would let him cling to his own. If he could become their shield, their savior, then perhaps he could be more than a hollow ghost wrapped in bone and lies. Ainz remained still for a moment longer, letting their emotions settle like ash over the ruined clearing. But his gaze shifted, drawn, inevitably, to the dying guard. The man had lost consciousness, blood still leaking steadily from the gaping wound in his side. Another merchant now knelt beside him, pressing frantically against the torn flesh, his hands slick with blood, desperation in every trembling motion. Yet most of the group had already forgotten him. Their eyes, wide, hollow, and unblinking, were fixed solely on ainz. Survival consumed their thoughts now, eclipsing everything else. The wounded man was no longer the center of their terror or their prayers. He was just one more life weighed against the monstrous, unknowable being standing before them. As ainz studied the scene, cold pragmatism stirred, precise, measured. Another opportunity. Saving one man, visibly, undeniably, would do more to cement trust than 1,000 sorrowful lies. These people were teetering on the edge, fear and pity warring within them. If he acted now, visibly, unmistakably, he could tip the balance. He stepped forward slowly, carefully, making sure every movement was measured, deliberate. Their fearful gazes snapped to him, drawing closer to each other, tightening their grip on shaking weapons. He raised one hand, palm facing them, a slow, deliberate gesture meant to soothe rather than command. "Your comrade," he said, his voice low and hollow, carrying easily through the gloom, each word measured, but empty of anything resembling human compassion. "He is at death's door. His injuries are fatal. Your efforts are futile." Silence. Then, a voice, raw and broken, tore free of the huddled group. The elderly woman, gray-haired, her face gaunt with fear, crouching low over the fallen guard. Her gnarled hands pressed desperately against the torn armor and the bloody, gaping wound beneath. Blood welled between her fingers, dark and endless. She shook her head, rocking slightly, and gasped out between quiet sobs. "We have no potions, no healers with us, not even a priest." Tears streaked down her soot-stained cheeks. "Even if we had a potion, it wouldn't mend this." Her body trembled, as if the effort to hold the man together with her bare hands was all that kept her from collapsing too. Too blunt, too clinical. Fool. The crack of trust he had been prying open was already starting to close. Softer, gentler, human. He forced himself to adjust, weaving something that resembled warmth into the hollow cadence of his voice, a deliberate thread of hope stitched into the ruins of dread. "But not all hope is lost. I can save him." Despite the horror strangling her, something else glimmered, desperate, clinging hope. If you can save him, I beg you." He saw the uncertainty flicker across their faces, the desperate hope, the deeper fear. They hunched together and said nothing, but their stares found ainz. Their faces were a mix of fear and something else. Not trust yet, but a flicker of it. A desperate prayer made flesh. Ainz stood still for a moment longer, silent, looming, smoke curling around him like morning veils. Then, with the slow dignity of a monarch accepting a sacred duty, he inclined his head. "I ask nothing of you," he said, lowering his voice to a quiet, steady thrum. Only a moment of trust. There was a faint, feeble nod. He stepped forward without urgency, without threat, and with a whisper of magic. Something gleamed between his skeletal fingers. It was a small vial of flawless crystal, so clear it seemed to trap the firelight inside. Delicate bands of gold circled its body, engraved with intricate patterns that caught the flames. The stopper was crowned with a ring of fine gold filigree, as if woven by unseen hands. Inside, the liquid glowed, a deep, lustrous red, rich and heavy like molten rubies swirling with their own slow light. It did not simply look valuable. It radiated power, undeniable, sovereign, unquestionable. Ainz knelt, a slow, careful, almost reverent motion, and placed the vial delicately on the blackened earth before the weeping woman cradling the guard's broken body. "Have him drink this," he said quietly. He did not force. He did not press. He let desperation work for him. For a moment, there was only the crackle of burning wood and the distant moans of cooling earth. Then, with a trembling, calloused hand, the elderly woman reached for the vial. Tears ran unchecked down her soot-streaked cheeks as she fumbled with the stopper, her fingers clumsy with fear and hope. With a soft, broken sob, she pressed the vial's mouth against the man's lips. The liquid slid down his throat, and the change was immediate. It was not crude. It was beautiful. From the jagged, blood-soaked wound, a soft light spilled outward, faint at first, then growing steadily, like sunrise through mist. Golden radiance pulsed from the torn flesh, washing over the guard's battered frame like a slow, living tide. The blood-stained tunic fluttered as unseen threads of light wove themselves into torn flesh and shredded muscle, sinking deeper to mend ruptured organs and broken vessels with effortless, divine precision. The man's labored breathing, once ragged and shallow, steadied. The pain etched into his face smoothed away, replaced by something almost peaceful, almost whole. He coughed once, weakly, but unmistakably, not a death rattle, but the frail sound of life returning. The travelers gasped, shrinking back instinctively, clutching one another as awe and terror warred in their eyes. One man clutched an amulet tight to his chest, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The goddess. It must be the goddess magic. If he bears her light," another breathed, eyes wide with trembling hope. "Then surely he is a priest, one of her chosen." The sight before them, the healing, the impossible restoration, should have been cause for weeping joy, for prayers of thanks. And yet, none dared step closer. Not yet. The miracle wore the face of death, and the awe curdled into silence, smothered beneath the weight of fear. Meanwhile, ainz froze inside, not visibly, but enough that it sent a brief shiver through his thoughts. The word goddess rang in his mind like a warning bell. Was she merely a distant myth, a figment of mortal fear and hope? Or was she real, and worse, a living, breathing will in this world? If true divine magic flowed through this world, if healing and blessings were not just learned spells, but acts of living will from a higher power, then he would need to tread even more carefully. Healing magic, positive energy, was a lethal threat to an undead like himself. Not by intention, perhaps, but by nature. He would need to investigate later. He shifted the information into the part of his mind that stockpiled dangers for colder, more measured analysis. To say he was a servant of a deity was a claim too dangerous to make, too easy to tear apart later. He let the silence stretch, just a little, enough for tension to rise again. Then he answered, voice low and absolute. "No." Their eyes flickered between the healed guard and the towering skeletal figure standing over them, uncertain, searching for something solid to believe in. Ainz recognized the hesitation, the trembling edge between acceptance and rejection. He needed to give them something more. Slowly, he lowered his hands. When he spoke again, his voice was measured, deliberately casual, almost conversational. "In my youth," he said quietly, "I studied healing magic." He let the words settle, soft, non-threatening. Not as a priest, not through any temple or religion. It was a hobby, before the curse. A lie, but a carefully crafted one. Positive energy magic, not holy, not divine. Just a simple thread of humanity to tie him to their understanding without binding him to their goddess. Enough to soothe them, but not enough to trap himself. Ainz watched their reactions carefully. The older merchant exchanged a glance with the others, cautious, uncertain. "Hey, a mage then," he said slowly, as if testing the idea aloud. "Not a cleric," Ainz confirmed, his voice quiet but firm. He would not risk inviting more assumptions about gods, about blessings. Better to be seen as a simple, cursed mage, a victim caught between forces they barely understood, that they could pity, that they could trust. And he saw it, small, fragile signs, the way shoulders eased, tension bleeding from stiff spine stances. Their weapons had been forgotten long ago, blades resting silent and useless at their sides. How their breathing, so tight and ragged moments ago, softened into something almost normal. They weren't at ease, not truly. Fear still pulsed beneath the surface, deep, instinctive, and unavoidable. No matter how many words he offered or how many lives he saved, his undead existence alone would always poison the air around him. Fear, once seated, could be softened, but never erased. But it was no longer sharp and blinding. It was muted now, caged. A pale flicker of trust had kindled in the darkness, and now, trembling, it began to catch. And trust, Ainz thought grimly, was a currency he could not afford to squander. As silence settled into the camp, Ainz kept his distance. Somewhere deep in the hollow spaces inside him, a faint bitterness had stirred. That he could look at a dying man and see only an opportunity. That survival demanded he think this way, demanded he sell tragedy and kindness as weapons. He shoved the thought down. He could not afford regret. And as he stood among them, visible, undeniable, without masks or illusions, he realized something else. He hadn't hidden. They had seen him, the full horror of him, and still, in their terror, had chosen not to try to strike him down. They had listened. They had trusted, if only by a thread. A terrifying undead, standing among the living, and somehow, earning the first fragile tendrils of trust from strangers at their moment of greatest fear. It was a small thing, a fragile, flickering thing, and for the first time, Ainz allowed himself to truly grasp it, not as a dream, but as something real, almost within his reach. Perhaps it was not too late to be something more than the hollow king his body demanded he become. Ainz remained standing, watching the survivors from a distance, their battered forms shifting uneasily around the makeshift camp. Their exhaustion hung heavy in the air, mixing with the lingering stench of blood and fear. They still avoided his gaze, their shoulders hunched, their movements jittery and wary. He stood motionless, his presence a silent monument to everything that had transpired. "I could have handled it better," he chastised himself. Even if it had been necessary, even if the threat had been real and immediate. The mechanical, brutal ease with which he had fought and killed since his arrival in this world troubled him. There had been no hesitation, no flicker of doubt, only the cold, instinctive precision of a creature honed for death and survival. His body, his magic, responded almost automatically now. A whisper of thought, and death unfurled without mercy. A simple gesture, and lives ended as easily as snuffing out a candle. It was efficient. It was terrifying. And it gnawed at something deep inside him, some shrinking fragment of the man he had once been. "Is this what I am now?" he wondered. "An executioner in fine robes, speaking gently even as I wipe away existence?" He exhaled, or mimicked the motion out of old habit, and carefully, deliberately, he stepped away. Slow, measured, regal. He moved as one accustomed to command but mindful enough, at least, to recognize when his presence brought only greater tension. After a few dozen paces, he found a large boulder near the tree line and lowered himself onto it, resting his hands lightly on his knees. They needed space. Space to breathe. Space to gather themselves without the oppressive shadow of death watching over them. His gaze drifted to the forest. It loomed, vast and breathless, an endless curtain of black. His dark vision stripped away the darkness, showed him twisted branches and shifting mists, but he trusted none of it. It was too quiet, too still, like the moments after blood had dried and bodies had fallen still. Ainz stared into that abyss and listened to the slow pulse of silence. No breath stirred in his hollow chest. No heartbeat thrummed in his bones. Only stillness, unnatural, unbreaking, a strange, endless quiet where life should have been. He caught the movement without turning his head. The boy, peeking from behind a crate, small and brittle as a sparrow. Another heartbeat later, and the mother had reeled him in, holding him fast with the weary protectiveness of one who knew how fragile safety could be. Their barrier was little more than hope and desperation stacked atop each other. He could not blame her. Ainz turned his gaze back toward the forest, vigilant. But the sound of slow, deliberate steps drew his attention once more. The older merchant approached, shoulders hunched, hands knotted together, every step a struggle between duty and fear. He stopped several feet away, bowed deeply, and raised his head, shame written across his weathered face. "My name is Aaron," he said, voice thick with emotion. "I speak for everyone when I say thank you for saving us. Please forgive us for how we treated you." Ainz rose smoothly from the boulder, folding his hands neatly behind his back. Even in the dimness, his towering presence pressed down on the old man, who had to tilt his head back sharply, his neck straining with the effort. A small, involuntary reminder of how utterly dwarfed he was before the figure in black. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Aaron," he said, voice calm but regal. "My name is ainz. Ainz inclined his head in a slow, deliberate bow, a gesture of respect, heavy with grave dignity. "And there is nothing to forgive. Misfortune has tainted our meeting." Aaron lowered his head again, more deeply this time, shoulders trembling. "No, sir." He shook his head fervently. It was shameful. We judged you unfairly. We reacted from fear, not reason. I cannot imagine how painful it must be to be scorned by your own kind." The words struck a faint chord within Ainz, though his skeletal features betrayed nothing. "I have not met others like myself either," Ainz replied quietly. "Fear is a reasonable response. Fear is the first gift survival grants." Aaron's head drooped lower, guilt written across the worn lines of his face. He wrung his hands together, glanced briefly back at the camp, then pressed on. "We are desperate," he said with blunt honesty. "Tired. Some of our supplies were ruined. We lost a good man." His voice cracked slightly, the weight of it pulling his shoulders tighter inward. "During the attack, we had to let our horses flee. They are trained to return to us, but—" He swallowed hard, glancing briefly toward the darkened tree line. "With those beasts out there, I am not certain if they survived, or if they will find their way back at all." He shivered visibly, the memory of the chaos and the screams etched into every rigid line of his body. His voice dropped lower, almost to a whisper. "We had never seen beasts like those before. We fear they are the works of demons." At that, Ainz's attention sharpened, the familiar coil of tactical wariness tightening within him. Demons. The word alone carried heavy weight in any world. But here, he knew too little. He did not know what form these demons took, whether they resembled the fiends he once faced in Yggdrasil or were something entirely different. He did not know the nature of their magic, their level, physical capabilities, their resistances, or their vulnerabilities. Assuming would be fatal, he thought grimly. Without verified knowledge, every encounter risked disaster. He would need facts, detailed, reliable intelligence, before even considering direct confrontation. Until then, he would tread cautiously, gather what he could, and treat every unknown as a potential threat. Ainz leaned forward slightly, a skeletal fingertip tapping once against the stone he sat on. "That is troubling news," he said carefully. Aaron continued, as if eager to get all his fears into the open. "We cannot reach Bach like this," he said, gesturing helplessly toward the broken wagons and the small cluster of survivors. "We are weak, sir. Only myself and one other man can still stand and fight if needed, and the years have robbed us of our strength." His voice trembled as he spoke. "We are no warriors. We are merchants, travelers bringing supplies to the village. The guards we had were brave, but they were fellow townsfolk, not soldiers. Our last guard remains senseless, though alive. We have little strength left." Ainz listened carefully, absorbing every word, every detail. Aaron bowed once again, lower than before, almost to the ground. "I beg you," he pleaded hoarsely. "Escort us to Bach. Protect us. We will offer whatever compensation we can. Please." Ainz stood silent for a long moment. "They seek my help," he thought. Despite their fear, it would be foolish to refuse. There were too many benefits: knowledge, rewards, trade connections, and the chance to gather information about this strange world. But more than that, something small, something almost forgotten, urged him to say yes. You mentioned villagers, ainz said, his tone thoughtful, mildly concerned. If undead are rare, how will they react to my presence? Aaron hesitated for a heartbeat, then drew in a slow, steadying breath. He squared his shoulders, not with bravado, but with the grim, deliberate resolve of a man who understood the weight of his own words. I will do everything I can to ensure they accept you, he said. His hands clenched briefly at his sides before relaxing, and he lifted his chin to meet ainz's gaze without flinching. His eyes, once clouded by fear and doubt, now held a hardened clarity, a sharp, unyielding resolve that burned against the darkness pressing in around them. I swear it. Ainz gave a slow, deliberate nod. Very well, he said, voice carrying the weight of authority. I will escort you to your village. He added, almost idly, as for payment, we shall settle that once we reach safety. Better they see me as motivated by reward, ainz reasoned inwardly. Selflessness would only breed suspicion. Aaron's face crumpled into a mixture of gratitude and relief, tears welling up in his eyes. Thank you, he whispered. The man hurried back to the camp, and murmured conversation broke out among the survivors. Relief, exhaustion, and hope mixed in the air, fragile but growing. Ainz watched them quietly. There, among the shadows, he caught a final glimpse of the boy, peeking once more from behind the barricade, his wide eyes now tinged more with wonder than fear. Maybe hope. Ainz straightened his robe and strode toward the camp. His steps were deliberate, commanding. The survivors stiffened, but it was not the trembling terror from before. There was tension, but also trust. He stopped a few paces away and spoke, his voice carrying across the camp like the toll of a distant bell. Greetings, came ainz's voice, deep, sonorous, filling the night air with its gravity. My name is ainz Gown. With a measured grace, he lowered his head in a slow, deliberate bow, a gesture heavy with strength, dignity, and the solemn courtesy of one who did not make promises lightly. Rising to his full, towering height, he folded his hands neatly behind his back, his black robes whispering against the earth. The twin flames within his hollow sockets flared brighter, casting a faint, crimson glow into the dark. Know this, he said, his voice deepening further, resonant, certain, carrying into every heart present. By the strength of my name, your lives are placed under my protection. So long as I stand, none shall threaten you. The words fell into the clearing like iron hammered onto an anvil, undeniable, immovable. For a moment, there was only silence. And then, slowly, subtly, a wave of relief rippled through the group. It was not loud, nor joyous, but it was there, small shoulders sagging, tight grips loosening, breaths exhaled in relief. Ainz allowed a brief pause, ensuring the weight of his vow had settled. Then he continued, his tone sharpening like a drawn blade. However, he said, voice steady, this camp is vulnerable. I shall see to its defense, that you may sleep without fear. He raised one hand, skeletal fingers weaving through the air with effortless precision. I will cast warding magic, he announced. Remain within the field, and you will be protected. Hesitation flickered across their faces, but slowly, they nodded. He exhaled, a silent, habitual motion, and closed his eyes, the flames flickering out. Within the darkness of his mind, a familiar weight unfolded. Over 700 spells. He could feel them now, a vast sea of knowledge, perfectly ordered, perfectly accessible. There had been a time, back in Yggdrasil, when even recalling a quarter of them required effort. The sheer volume of offensive incantations, defensive enchantments, utility spells, and necromancy skills had been a badge of pride, but also a burden. Not anymore. Here, now, each spell was a quiet star in the black sky of his mind, waiting to be plucked down with a single thought. He knew their effects, their range, their limitations, their costs. The data flowed effortlessly, neatly categorized. Some of them he had never even cast. Simple magic to summon fresh meals, to conjure beds of air, to mend worn armor, to ease the burdens of long journeys. He had gathered them all, hoarded them, really, convinced that one day, somewhere, they would be needed. For Touch Me, for Bukabukagama. Nishiki Enrai, Hiro, Albert, Peroroncino, Warrior Takamikazuchi, Yumeko, for all the friends who no longer walked beside him. Now, they sat dormant within him like unopened gifts, artifacts of a life already crumbled to dust. And still, he kept them, because letting them go would feel like losing them all over again. A faint pang, muted by his undead nature, stirred somewhere deep in the hollow spaces of his being. Now, standing amid strangers who barely trusted him, he would draw on that forgotten generosity. He sifted through the endless arsenal, choosing carefully. Spells that would not harm, would not provoke fear, but would protect. It would be enough. Slowly, ainz lifted his hand. Power gathered around him. Invisible, soundless, but the very air seemed to tighten, as if recognizing the sovereignty of the magic about to be woven. The survivors stilled. ainz lifted his hand, his open palm facing the camp. The air stirred, not with wind, but with something deeper, something that whispered of power old as the world itself. From the space above his palm, a circle of green magic sigils bloomed into existence. Intricate, ancient symbols spinning slowly, radiating a faint verdant glow. The survivors froze, their eyes wide, their bodies tense with a discomfort that was no longer pure fear, but the awe of watching something move the fabric of reality itself. The sigils expanded, growing larger, more complex, layers of glyphs unfolding outward like petals, each ring weaving into the next, forming a vast tapestry of magic in the air. ainz's voice then cut through the stillness, deep, commanding, resonant with a weight that seemed to ripple across the world itself. Anti-life cocoon. The green glyphs flared, and a swirling dome of soft green light rippled outward from his hand, enveloping the camp. The dome shimmered faintly in the night air, like a curtain of mist touched by starlight. The pressure of the forest, the threat of unseen beasts, seemed to halt at its invisible edge. The travelers shifted uneasily, huddling closer together, but the oppressive terror that had clung to them began to ease. Without lowering his hand, ainz spoke again. Anti-magic field. The spinning green sigils shifted, expanding further, and from their outer edges, a new layer of dull gray light unfurled. A soft, pleasant hum filled the clearing, not loud, but undeniable, and with it, the feel of magic itself slipping away. The villagers glanced around, confused, as if the very world had muted. No lingering tingles of dread, no whispers of unnatural forces beyond their walls. The stars still shone overhead. The world remained intact. But something deep, something unseen, had been pushed back. ainz's voice remained steady. Endure elements. The sigils spun faster, and a gentle, almost invisible breeze washed over the camp, sinking into the skin, the cloaks, the shivering bones of the survivors. The sharp edge of the night's cold dulled instantly, replaced by a warmth as subtle and comforting as a distant hearth. One of the older men blinked, startled, tugging at his threadbare cloak and feeling the sudden, improbable comfort seeping into him. His expression twisted between confusion and wonder. Finally, ainz turned his hand toward the ground. The green sigils pulsed once, then shifted sharply to a deep, glowing crimson. A new circle of red magic seals formed along the earth around the wagons, humming deeply, vibrating through the stone and grass beneath their feet. His voice fell like a stone into a still pond. Wall of stone. The ground shuddered. With a deep, grinding murmur, the earth cracked, and from the gaps, slabs of jagged dark granite surged upward, solidifying with unnatural precision. The stone walls grew swiftly, encircling the camp with imposing barriers. Their rough edges cast long shadows under the false light of the sigils still faintly glowing above. The villagers instinctively pulled back, clutching at each other, their fear giving way to something else entirely, a stunned, almost reverent silence. It was not terror that gripped them now. It was a terrible awe. The fortress completed itself in moments, sealing all but a single, narrow entrance facing the treeling. And there, alone, ainz moved to stand, a black silhouette framed against the stars, his presence a sentinel against the dark. Behind him, the survivors huddled closer, not with frantic terror, but with the wary, exhausted hope of those who knew, deep down, that they had been granted a protector. For now, they were safe. And even if they could not understand what he truly was, even if the sight of him filled them with discomfort and unease, they knew, instinctively, that while he stood watch, the night would not claim them. The mother rose shakily, her voice strained but determined. "Thank you," she said. A few others echoed her, timid but genuine. Ainz offered them a brief, slow bow of the head, the gesture formal and composed. "You may rest now," he said. "None shall harm you while I keep watch." Aaron approached once more, wringing his hands nervously. "My lord, will you be all right, standing guard all night?" Ainz allowed a faint, amused chuckle to escape. "I have no need of sleep," he said. "Focus your concerns on yourselves." He motioned for them to settle, and gradually, the camp grew quieter. They rearranged their meager supplies to set themselves for uneasy rest, blankets drawn tight around their forms. In time, silence settled in like a heavy, cautious blanket. But Ainz could still hear it, the faint sounds of weeping, the murmured dreams of the broken. Nightmares plagued many, even within the safety of his wards. Still he stood, vigilant. The worst was over, for now. And deep within the hollow of his ribcage, where no heart beat, he felt something flicker. Pride, perhaps, or honor. He did not regret his actions. In the stillness, he allowed himself a rare indulgence, a quiet murmur, almost too soft for even his own sharpened senses to catch. He lowered his gaze, studying his skeletal hands with a detachment that teetered between fascination and sorrow. The bones gleamed faintly in the muted light, pristine and unnaturally perfect, polished ivory without flaw or blemish. Each movement was precise, mechanical, effortless. He flexed his fingers slowly, the joints gliding with inhuman smoothness, the sharp tips of his fingertips catching the light like the edge of a blade. The magic rings he wore, beautiful, intricate things wrought of silver, gold, and strange otherworldly metals, shimmered against the bare bone, glistening like stars trapped in orbit around a dead world. He tilted his hand, observing the way the magic woven into them caught the air, the way the faint inscriptions along the bands pulsed with hidden life. It was beautiful. It was monstrous. Ainz's empty jaw shifted slightly, and in a voice no louder than a thought lost to the wind, he asked, "I wonder, would Touch Me be proud of me?" The darkness answered only with silence. But it was a silence he could endure. And that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to like, sub, and comment your thoughts. Support the writer link in the bio below. Till next time, Blazers.